Really excited to introduce you to Emily Calandrelli. Emily is a correspondent on Netflix's soon-to-be new show, Bill Nye Saves the World. She's a producer and the host of Fox's Xploration Outer Space. She also covers the space industry as a writer for TechCrunch and has been on the TED stage multiple times. Through her work, Emily seeks to explain science-related topics in an easy, digestible, and entertaining way, to increase STEM literacy in the general public, and to inspire more women to pursue STEM careers. Please welcome Emily to Google. All right, so before talking about how you discovered a passion for space exploration, let's start with why space exploration is so important. What's your elevator pitch to skeptical politicians?
Yeah, so it's hard to make an elevator pitch for this, right? I get this question a lot. It's the most popular question. Usually it's stated as more of an argument. You know, why are we spending so much money on space exploration when we have so many problems down here on Earth? And I usually skip the traditional arguments of, there's thousands of NASA spin-offs. There's a lot of great commercialized technologies we've gotten out of NASA research and development. Or the fact that, how would you live your life without space-based technology, without satellites, without GPS? Because I think those arguments are overstated, they're said a lot, and we've become numb to them, and they haven't convinced everybody yet. So instead, what I like to start off with is trying to understand what we're actually talking about here. How much money is actually spent on space exploration, right? So NASA gets $19 billion a year. And if you think of the federal budget, the total federal budget as $1, then NASA's allocation of that dollar is half a penny. So it's a relatively small piece of the pie, but it's still $19 billion. That's a lot of money. We should be able to have a great justification for spending it on space. For example, I think Google's earnings last year were about $20 billion. So if Google wanted to, they could fund the entirety of NASA.
That's good perspective.
Yeah, but it's still a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
So, but even out of that $19 billion, half of the money at NASA is spent purely on science efforts, on studying climate change, on studying solar weather, that the sun emits radiation toward the Earth, and that can be very harmful to our national assets in space, to GPS, things like that. Half of the budget is spent on education and on aviation. We often forget about that first A in NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA's doing a ton of work on developing planes that can be more fuel efficient, more cost effective, emit fewer emissions, things like that. So we're really talking about the other half of NASA's budget, the $8 billion or so spent on human space exploration, the traditional rockets, the sending humans to the ISS, going to Mars, that kind of stuff. So it's an even smaller piece of an already small piece of the pie. But theoretically, if I'm talking to a policymaker and trying to justify that money for space exploration, I like to talk about the 3 Gs: gold, glory, and God. And those are often used as the 3 justifications for early European explorers to explore the New World. They were their incentives, their motivators. And for us, I think it's very similar for space exploration. Those are similar incentives that we should use for space exploration. For gold, nearly every resource that we have here on Earth is available in nearly limitless quantities in outer space, right? And so there's already a few private companies working to mine asteroids and harvest those resources, and there have been prominent entrepreneurs who have said the first trillionaire will be made in space. And if you're a policymaker, you have to think, which nation do you want to be in control of those resources, ultimately? And then with glory, ultimately there will be a flag placed on Mars. And where do you want that flag to be from? Because there are many players in the space industry that are working to do that. China and all of Europe and Russia and India, they have great space programs. And one of them is going to be the first nation to land a human on Mars. And then with God, with the early European explorers, they felt like they had a moral obligation to spread Christianity. But with space exploration, I think we can think of that in a more broader context of culture. And when there is theoretically, ultimately, a colony on Mars, what culture do you want them to have? What government do you want them to set up? What civil rights do you want them to implement? And if you're the first person there, you have leverage to dictate how that all plays out. And then the last justifications that I give to everyone that I think are even more important is national security and the survival of the human race, just to put it lightly. Because 99.9% of all species that have ever roamed the Earth have gone extinct. And none of them, to my knowledge, have had space programs, right? They didn't have the ability to check the climate and see how it's changing over time and figure out where in the Earth they should live to avoid extreme climate. They didn't have the ability to track asteroids, or they certainly didn't have the ability to have the technology to move an asteroid away from Earth's path. Elon Musk always uses the analogy, setting up a human colony on Mars is like backing up the human race on a Martian hard drive. And I think those, above all, are some of the more long-term, really powerful justifications for space exploration.
So you've had, I'm sure you've had a chance to take that message directly to some political leaders. Do you find that your argument is persuasive, or does it get, and that you can break through by framing it a different way like you just did, or are there some just huge barriers to understanding that issue?
Yeah, I think it's hard to understand the really important justifications, like the survival of the human species, because that's not likely to happen in the next 4 years during their next election, right? They have to think election to election. They have to get their job in the next 4 years, and it's hard to make decisions based on something that could potentially happen decades or hundreds of years from now.
So you've had a couple. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. You've had internships both at NASA and with a political leader. What did those two internships earlier in your career teach you about the workings of NASA, a government organization, and the workings of politics?
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So I have learned from those experiences that when NASA is often criticized for being inefficient, or a lot of their projects run over budget and over schedule. For example, 8 years ago, during the Bush administration, we were going to the moon through a program called Constellation. But for a number of reasons, the program was over budget, over schedule, and for a number of other reasons, when Obama came to office, he canceled the program and said, you know what, no, instead we're going to go on a journey to Mars. That program was really inefficient. We're going to do our own thing. And it speaks to the sort of political instability of a NASA program over time, because when a new administration comes in, they have their own ideas on what they want to do with the space program. And NASA, I think, gets a lot of unfair criticism on that end, because when Congress gives them an engineering challenge, like we want to go to Mars in the next 15 to 20 years, they want to go back to their desks and figure it out and find the best technologies to do that. But then in addition to that problem, Congress is like, but also the congressman from Alabama has a factory that builds rocket engines, and you need to use his rocket engine because they want to keep all those people employed. And also the congresswoman from California, a very powerful congresswoman, wants to have her rocket assembly line kept in play. And so you have to make the maximum diameter of the booster of the big rocket that is going to bring humans to Mars be, this big. And then NASA is working under these very ridiculous restraints on optimizing this already very difficult engineering problem. So it's no wonder why things ultimately become over budget and over schedule, and it's hard to, it sort of speaks to why it's so difficult to ever implement a program to get to Mars.
Cool. Well, I want to go right back now to before you got into college, because some of the people watching this will be in high school and wrestling through, or parents of high schoolers. So you've spoken about not being surrounded by a lot of STEM role models growing up. How did you make the decision to pursue a degree in engineering? What led to that?
Yeah, I wasn't one of those kids when I was little that always wanted to be an astronaut. I liked space, but it wasn't something that I was obsessed with like a lot of my peers in the space industry. I liked math when I was in high school, and I Googled careers that would make a lot of money after college. And across the board, they were all engineering, right? And so I was like, I like math. Engineering's uses math and they make a lot of money. And so honestly, that is how I chose to go into engineering. But engineering's hard, it's very time consuming. A lot of people leave engineering once they start. So what kept me in engineering was because there are more opportunities for students who pursue STEM careers, and more interesting opportunities, more paid opportunities, more opportunities to travel, than I would argue any other major that you could choose. For example, when I was in STEM, as a student, I was 21 years old, I think I rode the Vomit Comet. I did an internship in China. I was paid to do, speak at conferences in Italy. Like, all of this stuff was things that I was able to do because I was in STEM. And I didn't see my friends who were pursuing other majors able to do things like that.
So maybe drilling down, engineering is such a broad term. So let's drill down on aerospace engineering. So for a student that's never heard that term before, or maybe he's heard it and is curious, bring that term to life. What does it actually mean to be an aerospace engineer?
Yeah, so it's aero and it's space. So if you go into aerospace, you either like planes, helicopters, missiles, or rockets. The people that go into that major, they typically leave and they work at NASA, or they work at one of NASA's primary contractors. For industry, they work at the Boeings or the Northrop Grumman of the world, or they work in the really new and exciting sector of private space, in the private space industry, like SpaceX or Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, or they go and serve in the military at the Air Force or the Navy, or they work for the Department of Defense or the CIA or something like that. Yeah,
this private space industry, just to pivot off that, what effect has that had on aerospace and the opportunities to do new and innovative things? Has it been a good thing? Has it been a bad thing? Has it been somewhere in the middle?
So touching on what I said before about NASA having all of these restrictions on how to implement the best solution to this engineering problem, the private sector certainly does have their own restrictions, like making a profit, which is a different type of restriction, but they don't have the congressional restrictions that NASA does. So they can innovate in a different way, which I think is really great. And Elon Musk came up with the interplanetary transit system recently, which was a really innovative, cost-effective approach to go to Mars, and is different than a lot of what NASA had proposed before. So I think that is disrupting kind of our approach to innovation in the space industry.
That kind of leads right into my next question, which is the Fox series that you host and produce, Xploration Outer Space. There was an episode focused on Mars. Yeah. So having, I know there's a lot that goes into creating an episode like that you don't see when you watch it. Great show, by the way, strongly recommend it. What did you learn about how realistic it is for us to conceive of having any kind of colony on Mars in our lifetimes or children's lifetimes?
Yeah, it's going to be really difficult. The cost, I think, is one of the primary factors of that. So the lowest number I've seen on a round-trip mission to Mars for one round-trip mission, leading up to all the technologies you need, is $30 billion, right? And if we're going to go to Mars, we would probably want to do something similar that we did with the Apollo program. You don't want to just go once, you want to go multiple times, and if you're really ambitious, you want to build a colony there. But the minimum number of people that you need to build a genetically stable and healthy colony in a new area is 40,000 people.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of a rabbit hole I went down recently. Like, how many people do you actually need so that, it's like not incestuous? And 40,000 is a lot of people. That's a lot of trips to Mars. That's a lot of $30 billion trips to Mars. So that in itself makes it really, I don't want to say unrealistic, but a really difficult challenge, especially when you consider the political sustainability of NASA programs. I mean, there's rumors that with the incoming Trump administration, they may want to go back to the moon and scrap a lot of stuff that we've already built to going to Mars. So it's hard to keep on track to one destination, and being able to afford those trips is just a whole another beast.
So I want to circle back to something that you said earlier about the Vomit Comet. I've always wondered this. I still can't grok it. Are you actually weightless, or does it just feel like you're weightless because you're still gravitational force? Are you high enough? Like, what is it? A sensation of weightlessness, or is it technically weightless? I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, so you're weightless relative to the airplane.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah.
So the airplane is diving down toward the ground, and you are both in a free fall.
Yeah.
So you're free falling within a plane. It's kind of like if you were in an elevator and they cut the cables and you both started free falling towards the ground, you would feel weightless within the elevator. So that's exactly, the plane flies in parabolic motion like this, and it's essentially a 10,000-foot roller coaster. And when it's diving toward the ground and you're falling within the aircraft, that's when you feel that 30 seconds of weightlessness.
Now, that weightlessness, if you were are you basically in a constant free fall and when you're in orbit? And is it physiologically different? In other words, when you're weightless in the space station, are there different physiological effects than when you're in the Vomit Comet for that little window of time?
It's the same feeling, but the physiological effects, I think, become problematic when you're in that period for a longer period than 30 seconds.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of fluid issues, especially fluid in your brain. They have a lot of vision impairment issues because the fluid inside your body acts a little bit different under extended periods of weightlessness.
So if you're looking for gifts for the holidays, Vomit Comet.
Yeah,
that's on my wish list to do one of these days.
Low price of $6,000.
Yeah, a little more attainable than the mission to Mars billions.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's all relative. Relative to that, it's cheap.
$30 billion, yeah.
All right, so adding to your cool factor, you get to work with Bill Nye, the science guy, probably one of the ultimate science communicators and a role model for many. So what can you share about your role on Bill Nye's upcoming Netflix series?
Yeah, so he has a new show that's going to be airing on Netflix in the spring called Bill Nye Saves the World, and I am one of 5 correspondents. Mm-hmm. So if you imagine what The Daily Show is like, they have field correspondents that go out and do different stories or segments. And so I'm one of the correspondents. Derek Muller of Veritasium, YouTube's Veritasium, he's another one. Then there's 2 comedians, Joanna Houseman and then Nazim Hussain, who's from Australia, and then Carly Kloss, the supermodel / Victoria's Secret model / advocate for coding. So it's a really great, smart, funny, super talented group of people that I get to work with, and we each have tackled 2 to 3 different stories in different countries around the world. And then the show will be talking about the stories that we've done, and then Bill and I will do a lot of experiments and bits, and they have a lot of really amazing guest stars on the show. So I think what I'm really excited about with this show is that I personally think that it can do what The Daily Show did for politics, which was, politics can be confusing and sort of annoying and sometimes very boring. And I think science in many ways can be similar. And I'm hoping that, and I believe that this show can do the same thing for science.
Cool. Well, another initiative, if you didn't have enough on your plate, is you recently announced, which I picked up just a couple days before this, is that you're working a chapter book series with Simon Kids to bring a love of science and tech to girls. Tell me a little bit about the series and the first book, Ada Lace on the Case.
Yeah, so this is, in general, I have this chapter book series that's meant for 3rd graders, and it's called Ada Lace, a nod to Ada Lovelace, what many people consider the first computer programmer. And I wanted to do something like this because representation in STEM is so important, and there's not that many books out there with strong female leads who have a knack and interest in science and technology. So Ada Lace is the main character. She's a 3rd grader with a knack for science and tech. She loves building gadgets and robots, and she uses her inventions to solve mysteries and solve problems.
Cool. Well, it sounds like a partnership with Goldie Blocks would fit into the works there at some point. That's very similar. Very cool. Engineering has a reputation of being one of the harder degrees to tackle, and you mentioned that it's tough and some people don't make it through. What advice do you have for surviving and thriving in an engineering program? Yeah, so I will say that when I was younger, I didn't consider myself one of the smart kids. Mm-hmm. I was more of a slow learner, and I was very intimidated by the topics of science and engineering and all of that. And so I get it. I understand how it's very intimidating because it was very intimidating to me. But I will remind people that there's a lot of time in the day that you can work to make yourself smarter.
on various topics. We waste a lot of time watching Netflix and on social media. And so there's a lot of time in the day to make yourself be better at certain topics. And I've learned that personally because I wasn't one of the smart kids, and I kind of tried to work my way up to becoming one.
Yeah, that's actually following the next question. You didn't consider yourself one of the smart kids yet. You got a 4.0 in college, and you got through a very tough program. Then went on to get a master's degree. In a way, do you think that maybe it helped that you didn't have the arrogance of I'm the smart kid, that you felt you had to work really hard? Or
I don't know. I that's hard because confidence can be really helpful in certain situations. It can make you sure of yourself, but in the same way, knowing that you don't know everything makes you always check your sources, always check your answer, make sure that you're always studying a little bit harder than maybe you need to. So being humble about your own intelligence is probably helpful.
Cool. What's the most common misperception about engineering that you find yourself correcting other than engineers drive trains?
Yeah.
Although I still hear that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. For little kids, when we go and talk to little kids about joining STEM fields, the narrative that's often told is, you can be part of the generation that shapes the future. You can build the next Tesla. You can build the next rocket. You can work on iPhones and all of these cool tech gadgets that we work with every day. But I don't often hear the narrative that you can use these skills to help the world. You can use the skills to not just make it cool and fun and interactive to virtual reality and things like that, but you can do it to help people less fortunate than yourself. And I like speaking about that side of engineering, Engineers Without Borders, for example, which was something I was active in when I was an undergrad, because I think that speaks really loudly to kids who want to help the world in some way. And if you can tell them that STEM will give them specialized tools to do that, I think that can make it sound really, really interesting.
Well, since it's a giving time of year, Engineers Without Borders, tell me a little bit about that. I hadn't actually heard of that before.
Yeah. Oh, this is an incredible organization. So it's a student-run organization for, I believe it's I participated in it as an undergrad, so maybe it's also for grad students, but you find engineering problems in developing countries or in areas that are in need, and you can apply engineering solutions to them. So for example, we sent a group of students to Nicaragua to build a water filter made out of sand, because they always have these really interesting engineering problems. So this village in Nicaragua, there was a school where kids were constantly getting sick because their water was contaminated with fecal matter, with waste, things like that, and the kids were getting really sick, and some of them were dying every year. And you can't just build the infrastructure for an elaborate water filtration system that we have here, right? That's unsustainable. So instead, we built a water filter made out of sand, because wet sand has these wonderfully magical properties that there's a biolayer that exists on the top of wet sand that can kill many types of bacteria, including fecal matter bacteria. And if you pour wastewater on top, or contaminated water on top, it's like just a huge bucket of sand. Out the other end comes clean water, potable water to drink, because the sand itself acts as a mechanical filter, and then the biolayer on top kills a lot of the fecal matter bacteria, or kills the fecal matter bacteria.
Very cool. Well, I got a few more questions, then I'll open up to the audience and I'll check the Dory. So you noted in a recent interview that it was once you got to college, you kind of looked around, where are all the girls? What are your strategies? What were your strategies for success in that environment? And then I'll pivot to more what we can do about it. But first, what were your strategies for getting through and graduating and not being one of the statistics that didn't?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of good advice for that, because it's not easy, and it's a little bit uncomfortable. I always try to turn the situation on my guy friends and imagine, what if you had no preconceptions about engineering before you got there, and then when you got into your first class, it was filled with all girls. It was a total girl club, and you were the only guy. It would be kind of off-putting. It would make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. But if you really like the topic, you deal with it, you cope with it, and you become like what I became, a guy's girl. All of my friends were guys. I would tell other girls to make sure that they are making and sustaining strong female friendships, because those are absolutely necessary through life, and they are hard to make if you're pursuing STEM, so you have to be more proactive about it than maybe your male peers. But for me, that's been one of the ways that I've remained sane through my career, and it's absolutely necessary.
Cool. Well, on the positive side, what have you found to be the most impactful when speaking with groups that are underrepresented in STEM?
For me, it's always about representation. I always introduce, if parents are trying to make science and tech sound more interesting to their kids who may be a minority or a girl, I show them role models who are in STEM that may look like or come from the same community or whatever like their kid. Because you can talk about the same things. Science is interesting, science is great, science can help the world, but when it comes from somebody who looks and sounds a little bit like you, the message rings louder and it feels more relatable. So I always try to find people on YouTube or good books or good toys that have role models that look like their kid.
Just to wrap up with a couple more. So you've spoken in TED Talks and others about STEM literacy, which is when we've started talking about politicians and how to articulate to them. Why is STEM literacy going to be so important going forward, not just for our political leaders, but the population as a whole? And maybe describe what you mean by STEM literacy.
Yeah, so STEM literacy, for me, it's anytime there is a science-related issue that affects your life personally. So things like genetically modified foods or climate change or net neutrality. Basically, it's anything that sounds really scary and complicated, but with a little bit of knowledge of science and tech, you can understand the situation better. And I think it's so critically important because I haven't checked the recent Congress, but the last Congress, there were fewer than 7% of our representatives who had a formal background in STEM. And when we're talking about issues like net neutrality, that is so scary to me. Because or genetically modified foods or climate change or basically, self-driving cars or drones that deliver packages, things like that, we need policymakers who understand science and technology. And if our policymakers don't, then our citizens must.
Very cool. And just to close, so imagine you're speaking to a room full of high school girls. What advice do you have for them as they think about college and beyond?
With my frame of reference with STEM, the best advice I give to girls is to lift each other up, lift other girls up, because when in engineering, if you're the only girl, you have this feeling throughout college or grad school or even your career that you're the token girl in any given group. You are one girl or two girls in any situation that you're ever in. And so if all of a sudden you're in a group with multiple girls, you have a natural instinct to want to be competitive with them. So I try to tell them to fight that instinct because life will be a lot better and a lot happier if you are lifting each other up.
You talked about role models and mentors when you're meeting with people who are underrepresented in STEM. How about for yourself? Have you found good role models and mentors, or do you feel like you're trailblazing and kind of figuring it out by yourself?
There's always someone I'm looking up to. I mean, it's hard to find people that I see exactly myself in. My role models are Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, people who are great storytellers and also really effective and efficient science communicators. That combination of skills, I think, is really unique. And I find it in people who are on YouTube and people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye. So those are my role models. Even for me, it's hard to find women in this science communicator role who are much more into their career. I have peers that I look up to who are at the same stage that I am, and I think that's fine to have a role model that's your friend as well, because you can always learn from each other.
So a question from the virtual viewers is, you've already mentioned the Vomit Comet. What's the coolest thing that you've gotten to get exposed to through either the programs you've done or internship with NASA in the space field as a result of this opportunities you've had?
Well, working with Bill Nye is hands down the coolest.
What makes him so cool other than everything you've already said?
He's exactly as you would expect. He's somebody who has been in this field for so long and has incredible science stories that I imagine him as sort of, your uncle or your grandpa that has a million stories to tell and just will go on and on and on, telling really fascinating stories, but, is just somebody that will ramble about science for as long as you will let him. And it's so endearing that this is something that he genuinely cares about and is really excited to talk about. So I love that. With my show, anytime I get to fly, I'm really excited. So I interviewed Dick Rutan recently, who is the famous test pilot who flew the first nonstop flight around the world, unfueled nonstop flight with Voyager. And Dick Rutan is part of the aviation duo. His brother is Burt Rutan, who actually designed Spaceship One that's in the hallway out there. And Burt Rutan designed Voyager, and I was interviewing Dick Rutan, and he was talking about that nonstop flight around the world, and I asked him, what was your expectation? Was it just as good as you expected? And he started to tear up, and it was one of those emotional moments. That was the last milestone in aviation, and I was talking to the man who achieved it, and he was getting emotional telling the story. And that was so powerful. And then after that, we flew in a test vehicle that his brother had designed that was not FAA approved. And we were doing aerobatic maneuvers in this plane. I mean, inside the plane, it said, warning, this airplane is not FAA approved. And then Dick Rutan wrote under it, that's what makes it so fun.
Cool. Other question from here we got one back here.
I love all this great science programming that I'm starting to see. I have a 12-year-old daughter who's really into science, and so we used to love things like Mythbusters.
Oh, yeah.
We just discovered the White Rabbit Project.
Yes.
And then now there's your program, and those two at least are both on Netflix. So I'm wondering if you're seeing Netflix is really taking this as a focus area for them, and how's it been working with them?
It's been amazing working with them, and that's my impression too. I don't have any insider knowledge on that front, but from what I've seen, it seems like Netflix is really investing in science programming. I've been talking to my manager a little bit about this. It feels as if there's been a reality TV show bubble that has bursted. It's been a completely saturated market, and now people are craving more educational programming. And Netflix, I think, has answered that call, and they've been investing in these projects. I hope they continue to do so. It's been really great in terms of finding jobs. So, yeah, I mean, we feel that the people who work in this industry feel the same way. It feels like there are more opportunities available now than there have been in the past, even 4 or 5 years. So, yeah, it feels like there's going to be even more educational programming coming online soon.
Cool. Great question. So another one from the virtual sphere is, you graduate from MIT, probably go in many different directions. The decision industry versus science communication, they're both industries, but very different than versus going to work for a corporation. How did that decision, did that sort of happen organically, or was it a conscious choice?
I was looking for jobs, and one day I got an email from a production studio that was like, would you like to be the host of an outer space TV show? And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. And so that's how that started. That's how that began. I had never tried to be the host of a TV show. I had never professionally done science communication. I did a lot of outreach. That's how they found me. Is I had spoken about the benefits of NASA and the value of NASA to public audiences before, and there was stuff on YouTube of me doing that. And I really like that. I think if I weren't doing science communication on TV, because of my master's in technology and policy, I would have wanted to work on the Hill for maybe the Office of Science and Technology Policy, influencing science-related policy. So I was already going that route, the sort of non-technical route, but working with science and technology, and then that came along, and it sounded like a really cool adventure, and now that's just become my career.
Cool.
I have a question about colonizing Mars. So there's a lot of talks about colonizing Mars. I wonder if you think it's a one-way trip, given that it's very expensive taking people there. It's going to spend some time like in the trip, especially living there for a while. Then coming back to Earth would be a problem because first, I imagine like a bodybuilder in Mars is going to be like just a regular person here, even weaker. I don't know. So how feasible is all that? How people talk about?
Yeah, so I will say that I think the only way to go to Mars is going to be with government funding, and that NASA would never allow a one-way trip to Mars. So I think in general, they will figure out how to do a round trip. People argue that the technology is already there. It's just making better technology to make it more cost effective. For example, one of the problems right now is the radiation that astronauts would experience on the way to Mars. By some calculations, an astronaut would definitely have cancer by the time that they got to Mars or by the time that they were returning, just because of that radiation. But what you could do is literally fill a spaceship with a foot of water, of simply H2O, and that would solve the problem. But that is extremely expensive, and that can be really fuel inefficient in propelling an astronaut group to Mars. So there's technologies that are out there that could be simple, but it's not really cost effective. But anyways, long story short, it'll eventually, I'm sure it'll be a round trip. I can't imagine anyone participating in a one-way trip to Mars or funding a one-way trip to Mars.
Cool. I made a question right behind you there.
Would you want to go to Mars?
Oh, definitely not. No, I don't even like camping.
So Mars is definitely extreme camping.
Yeah, can we talk about, have you guys heard of MarsOne? You guys have heard of this. So this was a big, I don't want to say gimmick, because I think they were very sincere in their ideas, but they didn't have the technology to really describe their mission thoughtfully. But they put out a request for proposals for people who would sign up for a one-way trip to Mars, and they got 200,000 applications. And I saw that, and I was like, I would bet my firstborn child that half of you have never wanted to go to Antarctica, half of you have never even thought about climbing Mount Everest, and probably many of you are like me and don't even like camping. Like, Mars is a terrible planet to live on. I don't think people really understand the full ramifications of going there.
And it's very light on Starbucks, too.
Very light. There's not many there.
And I don't think there's a lot of ice cream either.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk today about how we now live in this post-truth world. Does that change the strategy for you as a STEM educator? Is there some context there where we have to communicate differently if facts maybe don't mean what they used to?
Yeah, my strategy with that, and I think that there's always been some hesitancy to believe experts, or there's distrust of the scientific community, and there has been for a while. I think I don't know if it's growing. It's a hard situation to understand. But for me, the way that I address it is I always tell people, you are the most influential in your own circle of family and friends. And the most effective way to combat STEM illiteracy is to speak to the people who care about your opinion, and to have those hard conversations about climate change or about whatever topic that you find interesting and personally care about, because you are the person that they are most likely to listen to.
Cool.
In tech, I feel like we, at least in software development, we get to kind of stay as far away from the government as we possibly can, unless we have to. Like, we'll do the bare minimum to interact, because it's just generally a very slow institution. I feel like in space exploration, working with the government is at least half of it. So it's certainly not just about science and math and technology. Yeah. It is half about like policymakers. So would love to hear your thoughts about what it's like working a little bit more with policymakers, like how you navigate some of that bureaucracy and not nepotism, but like, short-term goals that a lot of policymakers have.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't personally work with the government, but, through my show, I speak with NASA, who often does. And what I think the trade-off there is that for people who work at NASA, it's very annoying to deal with that bureaucracy. It's annoying to deal with those restrictions. But at the same time, they are working on some of the most profound questions humans have ever asked. Like, where did we come from and are we alone? And so they get to work on some of the most exciting projects that any engineer could hope to work on. But they are working under a government salary. They're not getting paid as much as they would if they were in industry. And then they have to deal with all the red tape and the bureaucracy. So I don't know that that answers your question, but if you're in the space industry and you're working for NASA, you get to do some really incredible work and really exciting projects. But there's a give and take to that.
So I just want to close with one question since it's the end of the year and it's always good to end positive. So what of all the things that are happening right now in space exploration or science in general that has you most positive, enthusiastic, optimistic?
Yeah, I think the fact that people this is a very specific technology that I'm excited about, but Blue Origin and SpaceX working to perfect reusable rockets is just changing the game in the space industry. I mean, Elon Musk thinks that he can take that $30 billion price tag with Mars, and that would equate to about a $10 billion ticket for sending a person to Mars today to a $200,000 ticket to sending a person to Mars today because of rocket reusability. And so I think that once that's perfected and proven to be safe, it's going to completely change our mindset on going to Mars and expanding the human race into the solar system.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for those virtually avoiding the rain and those in the room. And thank you, Emily, for sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yay. Thanks, guys.